Yu-Gi-Oh has always been an expensive hobby, whether you're trying to build a collection or competing in the many tournaments held by Konami. For those trying to compete at the highest level of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh on a budget is almost impossible, as decks generally in Yu-Gi-Oh's history has cost an arm and a leg. There's always going to be that staple card or popular deck everyone wants to get their hands on, which usually raises the prices of those cards. Eventually, these popular cards will end up getting reprinted, but could potentially be hit on the forbidden and limited list, or just simply be power crept. That is why many players in the community appreciates the cheap alternative Konami gives us every once in a while. Structure decks are considered to be the forefront for playing Yu-Gi-Oh on a budget in recent years. Looking back at the Emperor of Darkness structure deck, you could buy 3 copies of it and pretty much have a competent deck ready to play at a tournament. On the other hand, if you were to buy a lot of the older structure decks back in the days, it was hard or even impossible to compete with the top meta contenders of the format. The main problem with older structure decks at the time were their terrible compatibility and they're impossible to summon boss monsters. Not only that, but the structure decks supported themes that weren't even good at the time. The Blaze of Destruction structure deck, for an example, was themed around fire attributed monsters, but most of them were awful compared to what was relevant in 2005. Their boss monsters is a joke compared to juggernauts at the time, such as BLS, Jinzo, and Thousand Eyes to Shriek, which were easier to summon and had much better effects. The deck didn't even synergize with itself, other than the fact that some of the cards required you to have a fire monster in the graveyard or on the field. The only good cards that came from these structure decks were the many staples such as MST, Pot of Greed, and Call of the Haunted, but it still wasn't enough to justify buying these terrible structure decks. Modern day structure decks fix a lot of the core issues that the earlier structure decks had. They are mostly built around archetypes nowadays instead of being themed around a certain type or attribute. The boss monsters are incredibly powerful and easy to summon. That monster is well supported within the context of the structure deck, and a lot of the cards synergize with each other. The Shaddoll Showdown structure deck is a prime example of what a structure deck should look like. A powerful archetype with a stable win condition, consistency cards to get to that win condition, and some staples to deal with your opponent's cards. Most of the older structure decks lack those components, which is why a lot of the structure decks failed to see any competitive play at the time. The value of some of these structure decks were insane compared to what we had in the past, and would even end up having a lot of stores go out of stock with some of these products. Even after praising a lot of the recent structure decks, I still feel like Konami has a long way to go before perfecting the way they make them. Some of the recent ones like the Spirit Charmers and Freezing Chain structure deck are just bound to fail due to the fact that both of the archetypes are unplayable and impossible to fix. It also doesn't help that Konami continues to cut these powerful staple cards like Evenly Match and Lightning Storm to at least give value to these products that are considered to be worthless. Even in the most recent Owlbash Strike structure deck, they somehow managed to find a card to cut from the original OCG structure deck. Another problem with some of these structure decks is while the product might be cheap, cards needed outside of the structure deck will become expensive. After the release of the Soulburner structure deck in the TCG, Salmon Great Sunlight Wolf as well as Lady Debug would end up being about $10. Another example is before the announcement of the Aluber reprint, it was sitting around $140 USD for just one copy. If it wasn't for that upcoming reprint for that card, it would completely eliminate the structure deck's purpose, that being a cheap deck for people to play on a budget. It seems like Konami is attempting to make cards cheaper, not just in structure decks, but in a lot of the other reprint sets. They're finally catching on to the fact that the secondary market is quick to shoot up the price of older cards if they ever become relevant. Even so, it is still baffling at the same time they have shortened reprint cards like Forbidden Droplets, and it ends up being around the same price it was before the reprint. Again, Konami does have a long way to go when it comes to making Yu-Gi-Oh cheaper after a period of time, but we still can appreciate the effort they have given on these last few years of product.